The funeral home smelled like carnations and something underneath the carnations that no amount of flowers could cover. I wasn't supposed to be there. I was supposed to be at my shift at the hospital, filling in chart notes for Dr. Reeves on the 3rd floor, but my supervisor had sent me home early because I'd made a mistake. A small one. A transposed number in a medication order that hadn't hurt anyone, but had scared me badly enough that my hands were still shaking on the drive over. I'd ended up at Fenwick & Son's funeral home on Dunbar Street, because my aunt had called me that morning and said she needed someone to sit with her, and I was the only one in the family who ever answered the phone on a Tuesday. My aunt was grieving a man I'd never met. A business associate, she'd said, which was her way of not saying anything at all. The room was full of people who wore expensive suits and spoke in low voices and looked at each other, the way people look at each other when they're all holding the same secret. I stood near the back with a cup of tea I hadn't drunk and watched them. There were women in black with perfect posture. There were men whose handshakes lasted a half-second longer than they needed to. There was a closed casket at the front of the room draped in white lilies, and a framed photograph beside it of a man who looked like he'd never once been surprised by anything in his life. I went to find the restroom. I took a wrong turn. The hallway branched in a way the signage didn't account for, and I ended up pushing through a door that should have been locked and wasn't, into a preparation room that smelled sharply of chemicals and cold air, and there was a man on the table. Not the man in the photograph. A different man. Younger, dark hair, dressed in a charcoal suit that was slightly too good for a funeral home preparation room and slightly too rumpled for a man who'd been laid out by professionals. His hands were folded on his chest the way hands are folded when someone else has arranged them, but one of them had slipped. I should have backed out immediately. I know that now. Any reasonable person would have. But I was a nurse, and nurses don't back out of rooms when there's a person in them. It's something that gets trained into you so deep, it stops being a choice. I crossed the room. I looked at him. His chest moved. It was small, barely perceptible. The kind of movement you'd miss if you weren't specifically watching for it, if you hadn't spent the past 4 years watching chests for exactly that kind of movement. But it was there. A shallow, labored breath, then another. I pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. His pulse was slow and thready, but it was there. He was alive. I stood in that cold room with my heart going absolutely haywire and thought, okay, think. I was a nurse who had just made a medication error and been sent home from her shift. I was in a funeral home where I didn't belong, in a room I wasn't authorized to be in, with my fingers on the neck of a man who everyone in the next room believed was dead. Okay. I pulled my phone from my pocket to call 911, and the man's hand closed around my wrist, not gently. His eyes opened. They were dark gray, and they were completely frighteningly alert for someone who had just been breathing like a man at the bottom of a lake. He looked at me for a long moment. I looked at him. Neither of us said anything. Then he said, very quietly, "Don't." His voice was hoarse, accented in a way I couldn't immediately place, something Eastern European worn smooth by years somewhere else, somewhere cold and northern. He was looking at me like he was measuring something, running calculations behind those gray eyes. "You need an ambulance," I said. I kept my voice low without quite knowing why. "Whatever's happened to you, you need." I know what I need. He hadn't let go of my wrist. His thumb was pressed against my pulse point, and I understood suddenly that he was checking my heart rate the way I'd been checking his. Evaluating whether I was afraid, whether I could be trusted. "How did you know?" "Your chest moved. No one else noticed. No one else was looking." He studied me for another long moment, then he said, "What's your name?" "I'm a nurse," I said, which wasn't an answer, but it was the truest thing I could tell him. "And you've been drugged with something. Your pupils are uneven and your pulse is GHB," he said, "or something close to it. They put it in my drink at dinner." He said it the way you'd say they put too much salt in the pasta, and the casualness of it was the most frightening thing yet. "How long have I been here?" "I don't know. I just arrived." "What time is it?" "Almost 2. Something shifted in his face. "Then I've been here approximately 4 hours. He released my wrist. Slowly, with what looked like considerable effort, he pushed himself upright. I put my hand on his arm automatically. Steady him, support him. The motion so ingrained it was purely reflexive, and he looked at my hand on his arm and then at my face with an expression I couldn't interpret. "You should lie back down," I said. "You're not stable enough to." "My name is Alexander Volkov," he said, as if I'd asked. "And in approximately 7 minutes, the man who drugged me is going to walk into the room next door to accept condolences on my behalf. I need to not be on this table when he does. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I've told this story to exactly one person in the years since, and she didn't believe me either. I want to say that I protested, that I insisted on calling emergency services, that I made sensible, responsible, medically appropriate decisions. I did protest. I insisted. I made the argument clearly and with good supporting evidence. And then I helped him off the table anyway, because he was going to get off that table with or without my help. And a man who's been sedated for 4 hours and is trying to stand up alone in a funeral home is a fall risk. That's what I told myself. It was even partially true. He was heavier than he looked. He leaned on me for the first few steps, with the full, unself-conscious weight of someone who's used to having people around who are capable and trustworthy. And the quality of that trust, unearned, immediate, absolute, did something strange to me that I still haven't entirely figured out. There was a door at the back of the room. It opened into a loading area, and in the loading area there was a black SUV with a man standing beside it who clocked us immediately and moved toward us with his hand going to his jacket. I froze. "It's all right," said Alexander, still leaning on me. His voice had steadied considerably in the past 4 minutes, which told me the drug was already metabolizing, which told me his system was clearing it faster than average, which told me various things about his physiological baseline that were not particularly reassuring. "She's with me." The man with his hand on his jacket looked at me. I looked at him. He was perhaps 40, with a scar through one eyebrow, and the kind of stillness that doesn't come from being relaxed. "She found me," Alexander said simply. The man stepped back and opened the rear door of the SUV. I should have walked away. I want to be clear about that too. There was a perfectly good moment where I could have said, "I'm glad you're all right. Please take care of yourself. Here are some instructions for managing GHB withdrawal," and walked back through the funeral home and found my aunt and gone home and never thought about this again. The moment was there. I saw it clearly. Instead, I got into the SUV. I've thought about why, many times. I was 28 years old, and I just made a medication error that had frightened me badly, and I think somewhere underneath the shock and the adrenaline there was something that felt like, this is something I did right. I had walked into a room, and I had seen what no one else had seen, and I had kept someone alive. That feeling, I'm not proud of how much it mattered to me in that moment. But I'm trying to be honest. The SUV moved. Alexander sat beside me and did not speak for several minutes, and I sat with my hands in my lap and looked out the window at the gray November afternoon, at the brown leaves still clinging to the maples on Dunbar Street, at the ordinary Tuesday afternoon going on outside the car. Then he said, "You're not afraid." "I'm very afraid," I said. "I'm just not showing it." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. "What's your name?" "Audrey," I said. Then, because it seemed inadequate, "Audrey Sinclair." "Audrey Sinclair," he repeated. "And you're a nurse at Vancouver General Cardiology floor." I paused. "I was sent home early today." "Why?" I looked at him. He was watching me with those gray eyes that didn't miss anything, and I thought, he's going to find out anyway, isn't he? That was the other thing I understood in that moment, without anyone telling me. This was not a man who left information gaps. "I made a mistake," I said. "At work. A medication error. It didn't hurt anyone, but it could have." He didn't say "I'm sorry," or "that must have been difficult," or any of the things people say. He just looked at me, and then he nodded, once, as if I'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "You're precise," he said, "and you notice things. And when you make a mistake, it frightens you badly enough that you can't hide it. Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It means you're exactly as careful as you appear." The SUV pulled into an underground parkade in the West End, and I followed him into an elevator that required a key card, and up to a floor that was not labeled, and through a door into a space that didn't look like what I'd expected. I don't know what I'd expected. Something darker, maybe. More cinematic. It was a large, quiet apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking English Bay. The water was silver in the November light. There were books on the shelves, real books, with cracked spines, and a kitchen that looked like it was actually used, and a gray cat on the windowsill who regarded my arrival with profound indifference. The man with the scarred eyebrow, Dimitri, I would learn, stood in the kitchen doorway and watched while I did a basic neurological assessment on the person who was, I was beginning to piece together, the head of an organization that ran most of the quietly invisible criminal infrastructure of the lower mainland. "Follow my finger," I said. He followed my finger. "Any nausea? Some headache?" "Yes. On a scale of 5, he said. "And before you ask, I'm not going to the hospital." "I know," I said. "I was going to tell you to drink water and sleep and come back to me if you start vomiting or your vision doubles." He looked at me. "Come back to you." I realized what I'd said. Figure of speech. It wasn't entirely a figure of speech, and we both knew it. I stayed for 3 hours. I don't have a good explanation for that either, except that no one told me to leave and I didn't want to. And in the absence of those two things, I simply remained. Dimitri brought tea. The gray cat relocated from the windowsill to the arm of the chair I was sitting in. Alexander slept for 90 minutes on the couch, which I monitored with the particular low-grade vigilance of someone who knows the difference between sleep and unconsciousness. And when he woke up, his color was better and his eyes were clearer, and he sat up and said, "There's food, if you want it." We ate takeout from a Thai place on Robson Street. Pad Sia, ew, and green curry and sticky rice in those little bamboo containers, sitting at his kitchen table with the gray cat, orbiting hopefully between us. And he asked me about cardiology nursing in a way that suggested he was actually interested. And I told him about the transposed number and the medication order and the moment I'd caught it. And he listened with the quality of attention that I was learning was simply how he was. Complete, uninterrupted, evaluative. "You caught it yourself," he said, "before it reached the patient." "Yes. And they sent you home, as a precaution. Standard procedure. That seems," he said, "like a waste of someone careful." I looked at my takeout container. Outside the window, the lights were coming on across the bay, the North Shore mountains going dark against a sky that was turning from gray to violet. It was the prettiest view I'd ever eaten Thai food in front of. "Who did it?" I asked. "Who drugged you?" He was quiet for a moment. "A man who worked for me," he said. "Who believed he had found a better opportunity elsewhere." "What will happen to him?" He looked at me steadily. "Nothing that will appear in the news." I nodded. I wasn't sure what I'd expected him to say. I wasn't sure what I wanted him to say. The honest answer is that I didn't push, and not entirely because I was afraid of the answer. Partly because I understood that there were things in this apartment that I was not authorized to know, and that the line between what I knew and what I didn't know was the thing that was keeping me safe. He knew I understood that. I think he respected it. "I should go," I said. "Dimitri will drive you." "I can take the SkyTrain, Audrey," he said, my name the way he'd said everything else, directly without ornamentation. "Dimitri will drive you." I went home in the SUV. I sat in my apartment in Kitsilano and looked at my walls and tried to make sense of the day and couldn't, and eventually made tea and went to bed. He called the next morning. I don't know how he got my number. I stopped wondering about that kind of thing fairly quickly. "How are you feeling?" I asked, because it was the first thing I thought of and also the most natural thing. "Better," he said, "considerably. I wanted to thank you." "You don't need to thank me. I'm a nurse. You were a nurse who was sent home early and ended up in a room you weren't meant to be in and made a choice that was not the safe one." I didn't say anything to that. "I'd like to see you again," he said, "if that's something you'd consider." I thought about it. I sat with my tea in my kitchen in Kitsilano with the morning light coming in off the street and thought about it seriously, the way I think about everything seriously, which is probably both my best quality and my most exhausting one. "I'm not going to ask you to change what you do," I said finally. A pause, then, "Good. And I'm not going to pretend I understand it or that I'm comfortable with all of it. I wouldn't expect you to. But I think," I said, "that you are a man who is very used to people who are not honest with him. and I am constitutionally incapable of being dishonest. So if that's useful to you, if that's something you want in your life, then yes, I'll see you again." There was a longer pause this time. When he spoke, something in his voice had shifted slightly, something careful and controlled giving way just a fraction. "That," he said, "is exactly what I want. The next 6 months were not simple. I want to be clear about that because I've heard these stories before. The ones where the woman walks into the dangerous man's world, and it's all tension and yearning and dramatic gestures, and somehow the complexity of the situation just sort of resolves itself around the feelings. That's not what happened. What happened was complicated, and sometimes frightening, and required a number of conversations that were very difficult, and did not end with easy resolution. I went back to work. Alexander sent flowers to the hospital. Not to me specifically, which would have raised questions, but to the nursing station, with a card that said "Thank you for the exceptional care," which made my colleagues speculate for weeks about which grateful patient had the budget for 24 white tulips. I said nothing. I got quite good at saying nothing about a great many things. We had dinner 3 weeks after the funeral home, at a Japanese restaurant in Yaletown where the chef knew him by name, and the private room in the back was available on very short notice. He was composed and attentive and asked me about my week and listened to the answer, and I thought, this is not what I expected. I don't know what I expected. Something more overtly intimidating, maybe. Something that would make the decision easier. "Do you ever think about leaving?" I asked at some point over the second course. "What you do, I mean." He considered the question with the seriousness I was learning to expect from him. "I think," he said, "that leaving what I do is not as simple as people who are not in it imagine it to be. That's not an answer." "No," he said, "it isn't." He looked at me across the table. "Does it need to be one right now?" "No," I said. "It doesn't." That was the compromise we reached, and it was an honest one. I didn't ask him to change. I didn't pretend the situation was something it wasn't. I asked him, once, to promise me one thing, and he looked at me and said, "What?" And I said, "Don't lie to me." And he said, "I can keep things from you for your safety, but I won't lie." And I said, "Okay." And that was enough. The thing that I think about most when I think about those early months is a Wednesday evening in February. It was -12, which is not unusual for a Vancouver February, and I had just come off a 14-hour shift, and I was tired in the specific grinding way that cardiology nurses get tired, the kind of tired that lives in your bones. I was sitting on the bus home, and my phone showed a message from him that said only, "Are you all right?" Not "Where are you?" or "What time are you finishing?" "Are you all right?" I typed back, "Tired, long shift. One of our patients coded this afternoon and we got her back." He typed back, "You got her back, and then go home and sleep. I'll call you tomorrow." It was such a small thing, such an entirely small and ordinary thing, but I thought about it for the rest of the ride home, and I thought about it while I made toast and couldn't eat it, and I thought about it when I went to bed, because there was something in it, in "You got her back." Not, "You were there when." That understood something about me that most people didn't bother to understand. That the outcomes were mine. That I carried them. I fell asleep, thinking that a man like that, paying that kind of attention, was either the safest thing I'd ever stumbled into or the most dangerous. It turned out to be both at different times for different reasons. That's the only honest way I know to say it. The man who had tried to kill him, whose name I never learned, and still don't want to know, was dealt with in the way Alexander had described, quietly, without appearing in the news. I knew when it was done because Alexander told me. Simply and without detail, and I nodded and didn't ask questions. We had agreed on the shape of what I would and wouldn't know, and I held to it, and he held to it, and in the space of that agreement something was built that I hadn't expected to be building. My aunt called me in March. She said she'd heard I'd been seen at the funeral home with a man, and she had the strangest expression in her voice, something between careful and wondering. "He's a friend," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Be careful, Audrey." "I know what I'm doing," I said. And I did. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I was not naive. I was not swept away by something I didn't understand. I walked in with my eyes open, and I made the choice that was not the safe one, and I made it clearly and deliberately, and with full knowledge of what I was choosing. I'm not sure I'd change it. I know I wouldn't change it. On the anniversary of the day I found him on that table, a cold November Tuesday, the leaves still hanging on, the kind of day that smells like rain and something ending. He took me to English Bay, and we stood at the water's edge, and he said, "I would not have made it through that room without you." "You would have," I said. "You were already trying to get up when I found you." "I would have made it to the floor," he said, "and someone would have found me, and it would have been a different someone, and it would have gone very differently." I thought about that. About the specific randomness of a wrong turn in a hallway. About the transposed number that had sent me home early. About the particular quality of a November afternoon that had routed me through a funeral home instead of straight back to Kitsilano. "I was sent home because I made a mistake," I said. "Yes," he said. "That seems important." "It does," he agreed. "It suggests that precision has better luck than carelessness." I laughed. The water was going silver in the November light, the same silver it had been that first afternoon through his apartment window. The mountains across the inlet were losing their snow early, which the news said meant something about the winter to come. He put his hand over mine on the railing. That was all. His thumb pressed against my pulse point, the same way it had in that cold room. Checking, measuring, making sure. I was there. I was entirely there. I'd found my way into a casket room on a Tuesday, and I'd come out of it into something I still don't entirely have words for, except that it was real, and it was mine, and I had chosen it with my eyes wide open. That's the only ending I know how to give this story, because it isn't finished yet.